My name is Harper Mitchell, I'm 26 years old, and I'm standing in the pouring rain outside what used to be my childhood home. My bags are scattered across the wet pavement, and my 78-year-old grandfather sits beside me in his wheelchair, looking smaller and more fragile than I've ever seen him. Just minutes ago, my own father screamed at us from the doorway, calling Grandpa Joe deadweight and telling us both to get out. I thought I knew my family, but what I discovered hidden in that wheelchair would expose a web of lies, theft, and betrayal that nearly destroyed us both. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Trust me, what unfolds next will show you just how far some people will go for money, and how love can triumph over the darkest betrayal. Let's get into it. 6 months earlier, everything seemed normal. Well, as normal as it could be living in my childhood home with my father Derek, his wife Brenda, and my grandfather who had moved in after suffering a stroke. I was working 2 jobs, serving tables at Romano's Italian restaurant during the day and doing bookkeeping for small businesses in the evenings, trying to help with the household expenses while caring for Grandpa Joe. Derek had always been difficult, but since Mom died when I was 15, he'd become increasingly cold and calculating. When he married Brenda 3 years ago, she brought her own special brand of selfishness to our family dynamic. From the moment Grandpa Joe arrived, needing his wheelchair and requiring modifications to the house, Brenda made her displeasure known with constant complaints about the old man's smell and how inconvenient it was to have him around. But Derek was worse. He saw dollar signs everywhere, constantly grumbling about the cost of Grandpa's medications, the wheelchair ramp we'd had to install, and the additional utilities from his medical equipment. Every doctor's visit, every prescription, every accessibility need became a source of tension. Derek would pace around the kitchen after each medical bill arrived, muttering about throwing good money after bad and how much easier life would be without these complications. I tried to shield Grandpa from their negativity, spending my evenings reading to him, helping him with his physical therapy exercises, and listening to his stories about Grandma Rose and their 47 years of marriage. He was still sharp mentally, despite the physical limitations from his stroke, and his wisdom and gentle humor kept me grounded during those difficult months. The final explosion came on a Tuesday morning in March. I had just gotten home from my overnight bookkeeping shift, exhausted but relieved to have earned enough to cover Grandpa's heart medication for the month. The prescription cost $230, money I'd planned to contribute to the household expenses, but Grandpa's health had to come first. Derek was waiting for me in the kitchen, holding my bank statement that had apparently been delivered that morning. His face was red with rage, and I could see Brenda lurking in the background with a satisfied smirk. "What is this?" he demanded, waving the paper in my face. "You had $500 in your account last week, and now there's barely anything left. Where's the money for rent?" I explained about the medication, how insurance had denied coverage and we needed to pay out of pocket, but Derek's anger only intensified. "This is exactly the problem," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You're enabling this situation. Dad is dead weight, Harper. Dead weight. He's draining us dry, and you're helping him do it." Grandpa Joe had wheeled himself to the kitchen doorway, and I saw his face crumple at Derek's words. My father continued his tirade, calling me an enabler and accusing me of being financially irresponsible. "You care more about that old man than your own family's stability," he spat. "Well, I'm done. I'm done with both of you." When I refused to apologize for prioritizing Grandpa's health, Derek's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Fine," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Then you can both find somewhere else to live. I want you out. Today." I thought he was bluffing until he started grabbing our belongings and throwing them toward the front door. Brenda actually helped, seeming to enjoy every moment of our humiliation. Neighbors began gathering on their porches, watching the spectacle as Derek literally threw our clothes, Grandpa's medical supplies, and my few precious belongings onto the lawn. The physical confrontation happened when I tried to go back for Grandpa's photo albums. Derek grabbed my arm roughly, leaving bruises, and shoved me away from the door. "You made your choice," he snarled. "Now live with it." The door slammed, and I heard the deadbolt click into place. Standing there in the rain with my grandfather, surrounded by our scattered possessions and the staring neighbors, I felt the first wave of true desperation wash over me. This was our first major attack, but I had no idea how much worse things were about to become. Soaking wet and desperate, I helped Grandpa Joe into my Honda Civic and loaded what I could of our belongings into the trunk and back seat. My hands were shaking as I called my brother Ethan from the parking lot of a nearby grocery store. Surely he would help us, I thought. We'd always been close, and he knew how much Grandpa meant to me. "Harper?" Ethan's voice was cautious when he answered. "I heard what happened." "You heard?" My heart sank. "Ethan, please, we need help. Dad kicked us out, and Grandpa has nowhere to go. Can we stay with you for just a few days until I figure something out?" The silence on the other end felt like an eternity. When Ethan finally spoke, his words hit me like physical blows. "I can't do that, Harper. And honestly, maybe Dad has a point. You have been enabling Grandpa's situation instead of looking at the bigger picture." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The bigger picture? "Ethan, he's our grandfather. He raised Dad after Grandma died young. He taught us both how to ride bikes and helped us with homework every day after school. How can you just abandon him?" "It's not abandoning," Ethan said, his voice taking on the same cold tone I'd heard from Derek. "It's being realistic about resources. Harper, I've been talking to Dad about your behavior for months. The way you baby Grandpa, spend money you don't have on his medical stuff, refuse to see that he might need professional care. You're not helping him by pretending he can live independently." The betrayal hit me like a punch to the stomach. My own brother had been reporting back to Derek about my enabling behavior, feeding him information and ammunition to use against me. All those conversations where I'd confided in Ethan about my worries, my financial struggles, my concerns about Grandpa's health, had been passed along to Derek like intelligence reports. "I can't believe you," I whispered into the phone. "I trusted you." "I'm trying to help you see reason," Ethan replied. "Maybe this is the wake-up call you needed. There are facilities that can take better care of him than you can." I hung up on him and sat in my car, rain drumming on the roof, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Grandpa Joe reached over and patted my hand with his good one. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out together." That afternoon, I used the last of my available credit to book us into the Sunrise Motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small and smelled of disinfectant and old cigarettes, but it was warm and dry. As I helped Grandpa Joe transfer from his wheelchair to the bed, I noticed how protective he was of a small compartment on the side of his wheelchair. When I asked about it, he just patted it gently and said, "Just some old papers, dear. Nothing important." The next morning, I called the Department of Social Services, hoping to find resources or assistance programs. Linda Torres, a social worker with kind eyes and a patient manner, agreed to meet with us at the motel. She became our first real ally, explaining various programs that might help with housing and medical expenses, but warning me that the waiting lists were long and the requirements strict. Meanwhile, Derek was busy spreading his poison throughout our extended family and social circle. I discovered this when Mrs. Henderson, who had known me since childhood, stopped me at the grocery store with a look of concern and pity. "Harper, dear," she said, "I heard about your situation. Your father says you've been having some mental health struggles and making poor financial decisions. I just want you to know that if you need someone to talk to." I realized then that Derek was systematically destroying my reputation, painting me as unstable and irresponsible while positioning himself as the long-suffering son dealing with an unreasonable daughter. Phone calls from family friends dried up. People I'd known my whole life started avoiding eye contact when they saw me around town. The stress was taking a visible toll on Grandpa Joe. His appetite decreased, and he seemed to be withdrawing into himself. He'd always been proud and independent, and the humiliation of our situation was devastating to his sense of dignity. Sometimes I'd catch him staring out the motel room window with tears in his eyes, and I knew he felt responsible for our predicament. After a week at the motel, watching my savings dwindle to nothing, I faced an impossible choice. I could either refill Grandpa's heart medication or pay for another night's lodging, but not both. As I sat on the edge of the bed, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how to make $37 stretch to cover both necessities, I felt the crushing weight of Derek's systematic attack on our stability and reputation. This was exactly what he wanted, I realized. He wanted me to break, to give up, to surrender Grandpa to whatever institutional care would get him out of Derek's hair permanently. But as I looked at my grandfather, who had sacrificed so much for our family over the years, I knew I couldn't let Derek win. I just had no idea how much deeper his betrayal actually went. Just when things seemed hopeless, my cousin Madison appeared like an answer to prayer. I hadn't seen her in over a year, but she showed up at the motel on Thursday evening with groceries and a warm smile. Madison was Derek's sister's daughter, 28 years old, and had always seemed like the most level-headed member of our extended family. "Harper, I heard what happened," she said, settling into the motel room's single chair. "I can't believe Uncle Derek would do this to you and Grandpa Joe. I want to help." Her offer seemed genuine and heartfelt. Madison explained that she had a spare room in her downtown apartment and invited us to stay there while I got back on my feet. She even offered to help me look into legal options regarding Derek's treatment of Grandpa Joe. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. But Madison brought disturbing news that made my blood run cold. "Harper, I think there's something you need to know about Uncle Derek," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I work at First National Bank, and I've seen some transactions that don't look right. I think Derek has been accessing Grandpa Joe's Social Security and pension payments." The revelation hit me like a truck. Madison showed me photocopied bank statements she discreetly printed, showing regular withdrawals from an account in Grandpa Joe's name, withdrawals that coincided with Derek's mortgage payments and credit card bills. According to the records, Derek had power of attorney and had been systematically draining Grandpa's accounts for months, maybe even years. "This is theft," I said, staring at the papers with growing fury. "He's been stealing from his own father while calling him dead weight." Madison nodded grimly. "There's more. He's been intercepting Grandpa's mail, including insurance correspondence and pension statements. I think he's been hiding just how much money Grandpa actually has access to." We moved into Madison's apartment that weekend, and for the first time since being kicked out, Grandpa Joe seemed to relax slightly. The apartment was clean and comfortable, and Madison made sure we had everything we needed. She even helped me start gathering documentation to confront Derek about the stolen funds. But when I called Derek to discuss the bank statements, his reaction was swift and vicious. "Those are private financial matters," he said coldly. "And if you keep harassing me with these ridiculous accusations, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. I've been documenting your erratic behavior, Harper. Your inability to hold steady employment, your emotional instability, your obsessive attachment to Dad. I think a court might be very interested in hearing about your mental state." The threat was clear, but I pressed on. "Derek, these bank statements show you've stolen thousands of dollars from Grandpa. This is elder abuse." "I have power of attorney," Derek replied. "Everything I've done has been legal and in Dad's best interest." "But your harassment and these false accusations? That's a different story. Back off, Harper, or I'll file for emergency guardianship and have Dad placed in state care, claiming you're an unfit caregiver who's endangering his welfare." The call ended with Derek hanging up on me, but his threats had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. That evening, I confided my fears to Madison, who listened sympathetically and encouraged me to keep fighting. It was Grandpa Joe who noticed the change in Madison first. "Something's not right about that girl," he said quietly one afternoon while Madison was at work. "She asks too many questions about what we're planning to do, who we've talked to. It reminds me of how your father used to pump information out of people." I dismissed his concerns initially, attributing them to the paranoia that trauma can create. But when Madison's questions became more pointed, and when she started discouraging me from pursuing the financial investigation, my own suspicions began to grow. The betrayal was revealed when I overheard a phone conversation Madison was having in her kitchen late one night. I'd gotten up to get Grandpa a glass of water and heard her voice through the thin walls. "Yes, Uncle Derek, they're staying here," she was saying in a low voice. "Harper found the bank statements I gave her, just like you wanted. She's focused on the financial stuff now instead of looking at other options for Grandpa Joe. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Yes, I'm keeping track of everyone she talks to and everything she finds out." My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. Madison hadn't come to help us. She'd been planted by Derek to monitor our actions and feed him information about our plans. The bank statements she'd shown me, the ones that had seemed like evidence of Derek's theft, were probably part of an elaborate setup designed to distract me while Derek worked on something even worse. The next morning, Madison's mask slipped completely. She informed us that we needed to leave because her landlord had complained about overnight guests. When I pointed out that she'd invited us to stay, her response was coldly dismissive. "Plans change, Harper. Maybe it's time you started looking at long-term care facilities for Grandpa Joe instead of pretending you can handle this situation." As we packed our few belongings back into my car, Grandpa Joe squeezed my hand. "I told you something was off about her," he said. "But Harper, there's something I need to tell you. I've been watching and listening more carefully than anyone realizes. Your father's theft is real, but it's worse than you know. And I've been documenting everything." He patted the side compartment of his wheelchair again, the same one he'd been protective of since we left Derek's house. "When the time is right, we'll have everything we need to stop him. But first, we need to survive what he's planning next." As we drove away from Madison's apartment, I realized we were truly on our own. Derek had systematically turned family members against us, stolen Grandpa's financial resources, and was now using legal intimidation to try to force us into submission. I had no idea that his next attack would nearly succeed in separating us permanently. With nowhere else to go and my savings completely exhausted, we found ourselves living in my Honda Civic. I'd fold down the back seats to create a makeshift bed for Grandpa Joe, while I tried to sleep in the front seat. We rotated between different parking lots, truck stops, and 24-hour establishments to avoid being asked to move along by security or police. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Grandpa Joe's health began declining rapidly from the stress and exposure. The cramped conditions aggravated his joints, and the lack of proper hygiene facilities made maintaining his dignity nearly impossible. I watched this proud, gentle man who had raised 2 children and built a successful carpentry business become smaller and more fragile with each passing day. I lost my morning shift at Romano's after showing up unwashed and disheveled one too many times. The manager, Tony, was sympathetic but firm. "Harper, I can't have you serving customers looking like this," he said gently. "Come back when you get your situation figured out, okay?" That left me with only my evening bookkeeping work, which I did on my laptop using Wi-Fi from fast food restaurants and libraries. The breaking point came when Derek filed for emergency guardianship, claiming that Grandpa Joe was being neglected and endangered by my inability to provide proper care. The court documents painted a horrifying picture of me as an unstable, homeless woman who was keeping an elderly, vulnerable man in dangerous conditions because of my own selfish attachment. Derek's petition included photos of us sleeping in the car that someone had taken and provided to him, probably Madison during her surveillance period. The images were damning. Grandpa Joe looking frail and disheveled, surrounded by our meager possessions crammed into the small vehicle. Out of context, it looked exactly like what Derek claimed: dangerous neglect of a vulnerable elder. The emergency came on a Tuesday morning when Grandpa Joe experienced chest pains while we were parked behind a Walmart. Terrified that he was having another heart attack, I drove him to Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where he'd been treated after his stroke. The emergency room staff was professional but clearly concerned about our appearance and living situation. That's where I met Dr. Sarah Chin, a cardiologist who became suspicious of Derek's motives when he arrived at the hospital with Brenda and a lawyer in tow. While the other medical staff seemed to accept Derek's narrative about my incompetence, Dr. Chin asked pointed questions that revealed inconsistencies in his story. "Mr. Mitchell," she said to Derek during our consultation, "your father's medical records show that his condition has been stable with proper medication. Can you explain why you believe his current caretaking situation is medically dangerous?" Derek launched into his rehearsed speech about my financial irresponsibility and unstable living conditions, but Dr. Chin pressed further. "I'm looking at notes from his last several appointments, and there's no indication of medical neglect. In fact, his medication compliance has been excellent. That's typically the first thing to slip when a caretaker is truly overwhelmed." But Derek had covered his bases. He'd brought Kevin Walsh, a hospital social worker who immediately sided with Derek's assessment based purely on appearances. Walsh looked at our disheveled state, our obvious homelessness, and Grandpa Joe's weakened condition and concluded that I was indeed an unfit caregiver. "Miss Mitchell," Walsh said in a condescending tone, "I understand your attachment to your grandfather, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do is admit when we're in over our heads. Your father is prepared to take responsibility for Mr. Joe's care and ensure he gets the professional support he needs." What they didn't know was that Grandpa Joe had been carefully listening to every word. When the medical team stepped out to discuss his case, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength and whispered urgently, "Harper, the insurance papers. In my wheelchair. The compartment. Everything Derek doesn't want them to find is in there." He was trying to tell me something crucial, something about insurance papers hidden in his wheelchair, but before he could explain further, Derek returned with the social worker and began the process of trying to remove me from Grandpa Joe's medical decisions entirely. As Derek put on his caring son performance for the hospital staff, talking about wanting what was best for his father while casting concerned glances at my disheveled appearance, I realized we were facing our fourth major attack. This time, Derek had nearly succeeded in using the medical and social services systems against us, turning our desperate circumstances into evidence of my unfitness as a caregiver. But Grandpa Joe's mention of insurance papers hidden in his wheelchair suggested there was still hope. He'd been hinting at this hidden compartment for weeks, and now I was beginning to understand that whatever he'd been protecting might be the key to exposing Derek's entire scheme. I just needed to survive long enough to find out what those papers revealed, and whether they could save us both from Derek's increasingly desperate attempts to gain control of Grandpa Joe's care and, more importantly, his remaining assets. That night, parked behind a closed gas station, I finally examined the hidden compartment in Grandpa Joe's wheelchair that he'd been protecting so carefully. With trembling hands, I opened the small panel he showed me, revealing a waterproof pouch that contained documents that would change everything. The first thing I pulled out was Grandpa Joe's original will, dated just 2 years earlier, clearly stating that he was leaving his house, his life insurance policies, and all remaining assets to me, not Derek. The will had been notarized and properly witnessed, making it legally binding. But according to Derek's claims, no such will existed, and as the eldest son, he would inherit everything. The life insurance policies were even more shocking. Grandpa Joe had 3 separate policies with different companies, totaling over $400,000 in death benefits. Derek had told the family that Grandpa was barely scraping by on Social Security, but these documents showed he actually had substantial financial resources that Derek had been systematically hiding and stealing. Bank statements going back 2 years revealed the full scope of Derek's theft. He'd been forging Grandpa Joe's signature to withdraw money, had redirected Grandpa's pension payments to an account he controlled, and had even canceled one of the life insurance policies to cash out its value, pocketing over $15,000. But the most damning evidence was a small digital voice recorder, the kind Grandpa had used for his carpentry business to record measurements and notes. On it were dozens of recorded conversations between Derek and Grandpa Joe, conversations where Derek threatened, manipulated, and verbally abused his own father. "You better not cause me any more trouble, old man," Derek's voice came through clearly on one recording. "You're lucky I let you stay in my house instead of dumping you in some state facility where they'd probably leave you to rot. But if you keep giving me grief about every little expense, I can change my mind real quick." Another recording captured Derek explaining his financial manipulations to Brenda. "The old fool doesn't even realize what I'm taking," he laughed. "I've got him convinced he's poor as dirt while I'm draining every account he has. By the time he dies, there won't be anything left for Harper to inherit anyway." There were love letters too, from my grandmother Rose to Grandpa Joe, written shortly before she died. In them, she specifically mentioned her concern about Derek's gambling problems and his habit of borrowing money he never repaid. She'd instructed Grandpa Joe to make sure Harper inherited the house and their savings because Derek would just waste it all within a year. As I read through everything by the dim interior light of my car, Grandpa Joe explained how he'd been gathering evidence for months. "I knew what Derek was doing," he said quietly. "But I also knew that if I confronted him directly, he'd find a way to have me declared incompetent or get me committed somewhere. So I played along, acted more confused than I really was, and documented everything." The most chilling discovery was evidence that Derek had been drugging him. Medication bottles showed prescriptions for sedatives that Grandpa Joe's doctors had never prescribed. Derek had been getting them somehow, probably through Brenda's connections, and slipping them into Grandpa Joe's regular medications to keep him drowsy and compliant. "That's why I was so tired all the time when I first moved in with Derek," Grandpa Joe explained. "I thought it was just depression from losing my independence. But once we left his house and I stopped taking those extra pills he was giving me, my head cleared up completely." The next morning, I called James Morrison, an attorney whose name Dr. Chen had given me. Morrison specialized in elder abuse cases and agreed to meet with us pro bono after I explained what we'd discovered. When he reviewed the evidence, his expression grew grimmer with each document. "This is one of the most comprehensive elder abuse cases I've seen," Morrison told us. "Financial exploitation, forged documents, unauthorized medication, emotional abuse, and theft of inheritance documents. We have enough evidence here to pursue both criminal and civil charges." But Derek wasn't finished with his attacks. Somehow, he discovered that the evidence was missing from Grandpa Joe's wheelchair. That afternoon, he showed up at the parking lot where we'd been staying, his face red with rage and desperation. "I know you took something that doesn't belong to you," he said through my car window, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Those documents were placed in Dad's care for safekeeping, and you have no right to them. If you don't return them immediately, I'll have you arrested for theft." When I refused to roll down the window, Derek began pounding on the glass, screaming about how I was manipulating a confused old man and stealing family documents. Several people in the parking lot called the police, but Derek left before they arrived, shouting that this wasn't over. That night, Grandpa Joe and I both knew that Derek's desperation was escalating dangerously. He'd built his entire scheme on the assumption that Grandpa Joe was helpless and that I was too naive to uncover his theft. Now that his crimes were exposed and documented, he was cornered, and cornered animals are always the most dangerous. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually have a chance to fight back. The evidence in that wheelchair compartment wasn't just proof of Derek's crimes, it was proof of Grandpa Joe's incredible strength and wisdom. Despite being physically vulnerable and financially exploited, he'd found a way to protect the truth until someone could act on it. We just had to survive Derek's next attack long enough to get that evidence in front of a judge. With James Morrison's help, we filed elder abuse charges against Derek with both the police and the district attorney's office. The evidence was overwhelming, and Detective Patricia Williams was assigned to investigate what she called one of the most systematic cases of financial elder abuse she'd encountered in her 15 years on the force. The police investigation moved quickly once they saw the recorded conversations and bank records. Derek's pattern of forgery, theft, and financial manipulation was so extensive that it couldn't be explained away as simple mismanagement. Within a week, Derek was formally charged with elder abuse, financial exploitation, and forgery. But Derek's response was swift and vicious. He immediately hired an expensive criminal defense attorney and launched a counterattack designed to destroy my credibility before the case could proceed. His lawyer filed a motion claiming that I had somehow coerced or manipulated Grandpa Joe into making false accusations, and that my own mental instability made me an unreliable witness. Derek's most devastating move was attempting to have me involuntarily committed for psychological evaluation. He'd been documenting what he called my erratic behavior for months, building a case that I was suffering from a mental breakdown that made me dangerous to myself and others. According to his petition, my obsessive attachment to Grandpa Joe and my inability to accept reality about his care needs were evidence of serious psychological problems. The commitment hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, and Derek showed up with medical records documenting every time I'd called in sick to work, every emotional outburst he'd witnessed, and testimony from Brenda about my supposedly unstable behavior. His lawyer painted a picture of a disturbed young woman who had become so fixated on her grandfather that she'd fabricated an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain her own failures. During that same week, we discovered that Derek's theft was even worse than we'd initially realized. Brenda, terrified that she might be charged as an accessory, revealed that Derek had been planning to sell Grandpa Joe's house and keep the proceeds. He'd already had the property appraised and was in preliminary discussions with a real estate agent, all while telling the family that the house was in foreclosure due to Grandpa Joe's medical expenses. The court hearing for the emergency guardianship case became a battle of narratives. Derek's lawyer argued that I was a homeless, unemployed young woman with mental health issues who was keeping an elderly man in dangerous conditions because of my own psychological problems. They presented photos of us sleeping in the car, statements about my job losses, and character witnesses who testified about my increasingly erratic behavior over the past several months. But Morrison was prepared. He presented Dr. Chen's medical testimony that Grandpa Joe had actually been over-medicated while living with Derek and had shown marked improvement once removed from that environment. He produced the voice recordings of Derek's threats and abuse, the forged bank documents, and the evidence of systematic theft. The turning point came when Grandpa Joe himself testified. Derek's team had been counting on him being too frail or confused to give coherent testimony, but months away from Derek's drugging had restored his mental clarity completely. In a strong, clear voice, he recounted Derek's years of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and threats. "My son called me dead weight," Grandpa Joe said, looking directly at Derek. "He told me repeatedly that I was a burden, that I should be grateful he didn't dump me in some facility. But while he was saying these things, he was stealing my pension, forging my signature, and planning to sell my house. Harper is the only one who treated me with dignity and respect during this whole ordeal." Judge Margaret Foster granted our request for a restraining order against Derek, prohibited him from accessing any of Grandpa Joe's financial accounts, and ordered him to stay away from both of us pending the criminal trial. For the first time in months, we could breathe without looking over our shoulders constantly. But Derek wasn't finished. As we left the courthouse, he cornered us in the parking lot, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You have no idea what I'm capable of when I'm backed into a corner. You think you've won, but I still have cards to play." His threat was ominous, but I felt stronger than I had in months. We had the law on our side now, we had evidence of Derek's crimes, and most importantly, we had each other. Whatever Derek was planning next, we'd face it together. I had no idea that his final desperate gambit would nearly succeed in destroying everything we'd fought for. Derek's card turned out to be a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a sleazy former cop who specialized in digging up dirt for divorce cases and custody battles. Webb had spent weeks combing through my past, looking for anything that could be used to discredit me as a witness and undermine my fitness as Grandpa Joe's caregiver. What he found was my DUI arrest from college, a mistake I'd made during my sophomore year when I was dealing with grief over my mother's death and made the stupid decision to drive after drinking at a party. I'd been 19, scared, and completely devastated by the consequences. I'd completed all my community service, attended alcohol education classes, and hadn't had so much as a speeding ticket since then. But Derek's lawyer presented it as evidence of my long-standing pattern of poor judgment and criminal behavior. The revelation was devastating in the context of a guardianship case. Social services immediately reopened their investigation into my fitness as a caregiver, with Kevin Walsh, the same hospital social worker who'd sided with Derek before, leading the charge. Walsh seemed almost gleeful as he explained that my criminal history combined with our period of homelessness raised serious questions about my ability to provide stable care for an elderly person. For 48 hours, it looked like Derek might actually win. The prosecutor on the criminal case began expressing concerns about whether I was a reliable witness, given what they called my credibility issues. Judge Foster scheduled a new hearing to reconsider the guardianship arrangements, and Derek's lawyer filed motions claiming that all our evidence was suspect because it had been gathered by someone with a criminal record and obvious mental health problems. I felt my confidence crumble completely. Sitting in Morrison's office, staring at the legal documents that painted me as an unstable criminal, I seriously considered giving up. Maybe Derek was right. Maybe I was in over my head. Maybe Grandpa Joe would be better off in professional care, even if it meant Derek got away with his theft. I can't do this anymore, I told Grandpa Joe that evening as we sat in our motel room, paid for by a small advance Morrison had given us from a settlement fund. Maybe I should just let Derek win. Maybe you'd be safer without me. Grandpa Joe's response was the most passionate I'd ever heard from him. Harper Mitchell, don't you dare give up now, he said, his voice strong and clear. That DUI was 7 years ago. You were a kid dealing with losing your mother, and you made one mistake that you've more than paid for. Derek, on the other hand, has been systematically stealing from me and abusing me for years, all while I was supposed to trust him as my son. He gripped my hands with both of his. You know what the difference is between you and Derek? You made a mistake and learned from it. He's made a career out of hurting people and has never felt a moment of genuine remorse. Don't let him use your past mistakes to hide his present crimes. The turnaround came from an unexpected source. Margaret Stone, our next-door neighbor from Derek's house, contacted Morrison's office with information she'd been reluctant to share before. Mrs. Stone was 73 herself and had been afraid of retaliation from Derek, but seeing the court proceedings had given her the courage to speak up. I've been watching Derek abuse that sweet old man for months, she told Morrison. The yelling, the threats, the way he'd talk about his father like he was garbage. I saw Harper over there every day after work, reading to Joe, helping him with his exercises, treating him with kindness. When Derek threw them out, I knew I had to say something. Mrs. Stone had kept a diary of incidents she'd witnessed, including dates, times, and direct quotes of Derek's verbal abuse toward Grandpa Joe. Her testimony provided crucial corroboration for our claims and painted a clear picture of the real family dynamic. More witnesses began emerging once word spread through the community. Derek's pattern of elder abuse wasn't limited to Grandpa Joe. Webb's investigation had inadvertently uncovered that Derek had been handling financial affairs for 2 other elderly clients through his insurance business, and both families came forward with suspicions that Derek had been stealing from their relatives as well. The police investigation expanded, And suddenly Derek was facing charges in multiple cases of elder financial abuse. His business was audited, revealing a pattern of embezzlement from elderly clients that stretched back several years. The prosecution realized they had a serial predator on their hands, not just a family dispute. Brenda, terrified that she might be charged as an accessory, completely turned against Derek and provided testimony about his bragging about his theft schemes. She revealed that Derek had specifically targeted me as a scapegoat because I was the family member most likely to care for Grandpa Joe, making me the biggest threat to his long-term theft plan. He chose Harper because she was the one person who would actually pay attention to Joe's welfare, Brenda testified during a pretrial hearing. Derek knew that if Joe went into state care, nobody would notice the missing money. But if Harper was taking care of him, she'd eventually figure out what Derek was doing. Derek's desperation reached its peak when he tried to claim that all the evidence against him had been fabricated by me in revenge for being kicked out of his house. But the forensic accounting didn't lie, and the voice recordings were verified as authentic by audio experts. As his legal position became hopeless, Derek made one final, desperate attempt to discredit our case by claiming that Grandpa Joe was incompetent due to dementia and that I had somehow coached him to make false accusations. But medical evaluations clearly showed that Grandpa Joe was mentally sharp and fully capable of understanding the situation. Derek's world was unraveling rapidly, and everyone could see it. But I knew from experience that desperate people do desperate things, and Derek's final attack would be his most dangerous yet. The trial began on a Monday morning in November, 6 months after Derek had thrown us out into the rain. The courtroom was packed with family members, neighbors, and representatives from the Elder Abuse Prevention Organization that had taken an interest in our case. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking haggard and defeated, a far cry from the arrogant man who had called his own father dead weight. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented 18 separate instances of financial theft, including forged signatures on checks, unauthorized withdrawals from Grandpa Joe's accounts, and the illegal cancellation of his life insurance policy. The voice recordings were played for the jury, allowing them to hear Derek's threats and abuse in his own words. My testimony was the most difficult part of the trial. Derek's lawyer tried repeatedly to attack my credibility, bringing up the old DUI and questioning my mental stability, but Morrison had prepared me well. I spoke clearly and honestly about caring for Grandpa Joe, about discovering Derek's theft, and about our months of homelessness and fear. I never wanted any of this, I told the jury. I just wanted to take care of the man who had helped raise me and taught me what unconditional love looked like. I had no idea that my own father was capable of such systematic cruelty toward his own parent. Grandpa Joe's testimony was devastating to Derek's case. Speaking in a strong, clear voice, he recounted years of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and threats. He explained how Derek had gradually isolated him from friends and other family members, making him completely dependent on Derek's generosity while secretly draining his life savings. My son made me feel like I was worthless, Grandpa Joe said, his voice breaking slightly. He convinced me that I was a burden to everyone, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity he allowed me. But Harper showed me that I still had value, that I deserved to be treated with respect and love. Dr. Chen's medical testimony revealed the full extent of Derek's drugging scheme. The unauthorized sedatives Derek had been giving Grandpa Joe could have caused serious health complications and had significantly impaired his cognitive function and physical coordination. What Derek claimed was natural aging and decline had actually been medically induced dependence. The financial audit presented by forensic accountant Linda Rodriguez showed that Derek had stolen over $230,000 from Grandpa Joe over the course of 3 years. This included pension payments, Social Security benefits, insurance payouts, and the forced sale of stocks and bonds that Grandpa Joe didn't even know he still owned. Derek's defense was pathetic. His lawyer tried to argue that Derek had been acting in Grandpa Joe's best interests, managing money that his father was too confused to handle properly. But the evidence showed that Derek had used the stolen money for his own mortgage payments, credit card bills, and even a vacation to Las Vegas with Brenda. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Foster sentenced Derek to 6 years in federal prison plus full restitution of the stolen funds. She also imposed a permanent restraining order preventing Derek from having any contact with Grandpa Joe or access to his financial affairs. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Foster said, addressing Derek directly, "you systematically betrayed the trust of the most vulnerable member of your family. You stole not just money, but dignity, security, and peace of mind from a man who deserved your protection and respect. Your actions represent a profound moral failure that this court cannot overlook." The civil penalties were equally devastating for Derek. His insurance business was permanently shut down, his assets were seized to pay restitution to Grandpa Joe and his other victims, and he faced additional lawsuits from the families of other elderly clients he had defrauded. Brenda divorced Derek before the sentencing and moved out of the family home, which reverted to Grandpa Joe's ownership. The house had been in Grandpa Joe's name all along. Derek had been lying about the mortgage and ownership to justify his control over the property. In the months following the trial, our lives slowly returned to normal. We moved back into Grandpa Joe's house, which felt like coming home after a long, terrible journey. The insurance companies paid out Grandpa Joe's legitimate claims that Derek had been blocking, providing the financial security that had been stolen from him. I was able to quit my restaurant job and expand my bookkeeping business, working from home so I could be available to help Grandpa Joe with his physical therapy and medical appointments. My relationship with Dr. Chen deepened into a genuine friendship and the beginning of something more romantic, built on shared values and mutual respect. Ethan attempted to reconcile with me several months after Derek's conviction, sending a long letter apologizing for his betrayal and asking if we could rebuild our relationship. I agreed to meet with him, but I made it clear that trust would have to be earned back slowly and that my primary loyalty would always be to Grandpa Joe. Madison also faced legal consequences for her role in Derek's scheme. She was charged with conspiracy and sentenced to community service and probation. She lost her job at the bank and moved away from town, apparently too ashamed to face the family she had helped betray. The community support that emerged during the trial was overwhelming. Romano's restaurant offered me my job back with a raise, understanding the full context of why I had struggled to maintain employment during our crisis. Neighbors who had watched Derek's abuse for months came forward to apologize for not intervening sooner and to offer their ongoing support. Mrs. Henderson, who had initially believed Derek's lies about my mental health, became one of our strongest advocates in the neighborhood. She organized a meal train during Grandpa Joe's recovery from the stress-related health problems and helped connect us with other community resources. 6 months after Derek's conviction, I was sitting on the front porch of our restored family home, watching Grandpa Joe tend to the flower garden that had been Grandma Rose's pride and joy. His health had improved dramatically once the stress of Derek's abuse was removed from his life. The physical therapy was helping with his mobility, and his appetite and energy had returned to levels I hadn't seen since before his stroke. The house itself had been transformed back into a home. I'd used some of the restitution money to make it fully wheelchair accessible while preserving its warmth and character. The bedroom that had been Grandma Rose's sewing room became Grandpa Joe's main living space, with French doors opening onto the garden and enough room for all his medical equipment without feeling institutional. My bookkeeping business had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. Word of mouth from satisfied clients had brought me more work than I could handle on my own, and I was considering hiring an assistant. Working from home allowed me to be available for Grandpa Joe's needs while building financial security for both of us. Dr. Sarah Chin had become a regular presence in our lives. What had started as professional concern for Grandpa Joe's welfare had evolved into friendship and then romance. Sarah understood the depth of trauma that elder abuse creates and was patient as I learned to trust again after Derek's systematic betrayal. Her medical background also meant she could help me understand Grandpa Joe's health needs and advocate for appropriate care. The legal victory had been important, but the personal healing was more complex and ongoing. Therapy with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in family trauma, helped me work through the devastating realization that my own father had been capable of such calculated cruelty toward someone he should have protected. The sessions helped me understand that Derek's abuse of Grandpa Joe wasn't really about money, it was about power and control over someone vulnerable. Grandpa Joe and I spent many evenings on the porch, talking about family history that Derek had tried to erase. He shared stories about Grandma Rose's courage during his military deployment, about Derek's childhood before gambling and selfishness corrupted his character, and about his hopes for my future. These conversations helped me understand that loving families aren't perfect families. They're families where people choose to protect and support each other despite human flaws and failures. The most meaningful development was my volunteer work with the Elder Rights Coalition, a non-profit organization dedicated to preventing elder abuse and supporting victims. My experience with Derek's systematic theft and manipulation had given me unique insights into how predators operate and how family members can be turned against each other. I began speaking at community education events, sharing our story to help other families recognize warning signs before the damage becomes irreversible. Ethan and I had slowly begun rebuilding our relationship, but with clear boundaries. He'd been horrified to learn the full extent of Derek's crimes and his own unwitting role in isolating Grandpa Joe from potential help. Our conversations were cautious but honest, focused on understanding how family loyalty can be weaponized by manipulative people. I forgave him, but I also made it clear that trust would be earned through actions, not just words. The financial recovery exceeded our expectations. Derek's restitution payments, combined with Grandpa Joe's restored access to his legitimate benefits and the insurance policy payouts, provided comfortable security for both of us. More importantly, it meant Grandpa Joe could receive the best possible medical care and maintain his independence in his own home for as long as possible. Community relationships that had been damaged by Derek's lies were gradually rebuilt. People who had believed his stories about my mental instability came to understand how systematic family abuse can make victims appear unstable to outsiders. Mrs. Henderson organized a neighborhood support network for elderly residents, ensuring that isolated seniors would have regular check-ins and social connections that could prevent future abuse. The legal case had broader implications as well. Derek's conviction led to enhanced oversight of financial advisors working with elderly clients and new training requirements for bank employees to recognize signs of elder financial abuse. The voice recordings that Grandpa Joe had courageously collected became part of a training program used by law enforcement agencies across the state. But the most profound change was in my relationship with Grandpa Joe himself. The crisis had shown us both what unconditional love really means. It means staying when leaving would be easier, fighting when surrender seems rational, and protecting someone's dignity even when they can't protect it themselves. Derek had called him dead weight, but Grandpa Joe had proven to be the strongest person I knew. As autumn arrived and I helped Grandpa Joe prepare Grandma Rose's garden for winter, he shared the wisdom that had sustained him through Derek's abuse. "Harper," he said, his weathered hands gentle on the rose bushes, "your father lost his way somewhere along the line. Maybe it was the gambling, maybe it was something else, but he chose to see family as a source of profit instead of love. That's not on you, and it's not on me. All we can control is how we choose to treat each other." He paused, looking at the house that Derek had tried to steal from him. "Family isn't just about blood, sweetheart. It's about who shows up when everything goes wrong, who sacrifices for your welfare, who protects your dignity when you can't do it yourself. By that definition, you're the best family I've ever had." The experience had taught me that real strength doesn't come from avoiding hardship, it comes from standing up for what's right even when the cost is enormous. Derek had counted on my loyalty to family making me an easy target, but he'd misunderstood what family loyalty really means. It means protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. It means choosing love over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness. Today, as I write this story, Grandpa Joe is 80 years old and still living independently in our home. Derek was released from prison last year but remains under court supervision and is prohibited from contact with any of us. His financial crimes have left him essentially bankrupt, and his reputation in our community is permanently destroyed. Looking back, I'm grateful that we found that evidence in Grandpa Joe's wheelchair when we did. But I'm even more grateful for what the entire experience taught me about the difference between being family and being related. Derek may have been Grandpa Joe's biological son, but he chose to be his predator. I chose to be his protector, and that choice made all the difference. The most important lesson is this. When someone you love is being abused, especially an elderly person who may not be able to advocate for themselves, don't let anyone convince you that your protective instincts are wrong. Trust what you see, document what you can, and never stop fighting for their dignity and rights. Sometimes being the good guy means being called the bad guy by people who profit from the abuse. Grandpa Joe often says that the wheelchair compartment where he hid our evidence was like a treasure chest, protecting the truth until someone could act on it. But the real treasure wasn't the papers or the recordings. It was the reminder that love is stronger than greed, that justice sometimes takes time but is worth fighting for, and that the most important family bonds are the ones we choose to honor through our actions every single day. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and protecting someone you love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life family stories. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with elder abuse or family betrayal. Remember, you're never alone in these struggles, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's cruelty. Thank you for listening to our story, and I hope it gives you courage to stand up for what's right in your own life. Stay strong, and remember that love always wins in the end.